"Are you sure this is the right place, Caldwell? It looks like it's about to fall over." The voice of Agent Finch was thin, tinny through the car's Bluetooth speaker, a stark contrast to the heavy drumming rain that hammered against the roof and windshield of the black government sedan. Agent Marcus Caldwell squinted through the frantic rhythm of the wipers, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The farmhouse at the end of the muddy track was less a building and more a collection of weary timbers and faded paint, huddling against the oppressive gray sky of the burgeoning Nebraska storm. It looked like one good gust of wind would turn it into a pile of kindling. "The file said this is the address for the fail-safe node," Caldwell replied, his own voice tight with frustration and disbelief. "File was last updated in 1984, Mark. The node is probably a pile of rust in that collapsing barn." Caldwell killed the engine, and the sudden silence was more profound than the noise. Only the percussive sound of the rain remained. "Orders are to verify. We're out of options. The entire C4ISR network is dark from Omaha to Cheyenne. Everything is down. This is the last resort on a list of last resorts." He unbuckled his seatbelt with a sharp, angry click. "Stay on the line. I'm going in." He pulled the collar of his expensive trench coat tighter around his neck and pushed the door open, immediately hit by a wall of wind and water. The air smelled of wet earth, ozone, and something else, something old and settled, like history itself. He slammed the door and trudged through the sucking mud, his polished shoes disappearing into the mire. The porch steps groaned under his weight, each one a complaint against the intrusion. He knocked on the door, a sharp, authoritative rap that felt strangely out of place, like shouting in a library. For a long moment, there was no answer. He was about to knock again, harder this time, when the door creaked open. The man standing there was as weathered as the house. He was tall but stooped, his frame thin under a faded flannel shirt and worn denim trousers. His face was a roadmap of deep lines etched by sun and time, and his pale blue eyes, though clouded with age, held a stillness that was unnerving. His hands, resting on the doorframe, were gnarled and thick with calluses, the knuckles swollen. They were the hands of a man who had wrestled a living from the earth for a lifetime. "Help you?" The man's voice was raspy but not weak. It was a low, quiet rumble, like stones moving at the bottom of a river. "Samuel Keene?" Caldwell asked, flashing his credentials in a practiced, fluid motion. The old man's eyes didn't even flick down to the badge. They stayed on Caldwell's face, calm and assessing. "I am. Agent Caldwell, Federal Security Agency. I need to come in. It's a matter of national security." Caldwell's tone was clipped, professional. He was used to doors opening for him, to people responding to the inherent authority in his voice and title. Keene just looked at him for another second, his gaze taking in the drenched coat, the impatient stance, the tension in his jaw. Then, without a word, he stepped back, holding the door open. The inside of the house was simple, clean, and smelled of wood smoke and old books. It was Spartan, but not neglected. Every object seemed to have its place, a sense of order that contrasted with the decaying exterior. Caldwell stepped inside, dripping onto a worn but clean rag rug. "We have a situation, Mr. Keene," he began, already pulling a secure tablet from his inner pocket. Useless without a signal. "There's been a complete communications blackout across the central grid. We have reason to believe this location is a designated emergency relay point, a fail-safe node." He said the words with a barely concealed skepticism. The old farmer simply watched him, his expression unreadable. He hadn't invited Caldwell to sit, hadn't shown any sign of surprise or concern. He just stood there, a pillar of quiet patience, waiting. The silence stretched, broken only by the storm's fury outside. Caldwell felt a prickle of irritation. He was a man of action, of clear directives and immediate responses. This slow agrarian pace was setting his teeth on edge. "Mr. Keene, I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. We have critical intelligence that needs to be transmitted to Stratcom immediately. We're talking about a potential threat to national infrastructure." He gestured vaguely with the dead tablet. "We need access to your broadcast equipment. The file mentions a GhostNet uplink terminal." Samuel Keene finally moved. He walked past Caldwell, his worn work boots making almost no sound on the old wooden floorboards. He went to a window and looked out at the swaying trees, his back to the agent. "Sky's getting dark," he said, his voice still that low, even murmur. "Wind's picking up from the northwest. We'll have hail in an hour." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "I am not here to discuss the weather. I need access to the terminal now. If you are not cooperative, I am authorized to secure the premises and conduct a search." It was a bluff, mostly. His orders were to gain cooperation, but his patience was wearing thin. The old man turned from the window, his gaze sweeping over Caldwell again. It wasn't a hostile look, but it was intensely analytical. It felt less like being seen and more like being scanned. "What's the signal degradation at the 300 megahertz band?" Keene asked. The question was so unexpected, so technically specific, that it took Caldwell a moment to even process it. "What?" "The blackout," Keene clarified, his voice patient, as if explaining something to a child. "Is it a full-spectrum jam, or are you seeing anomalous propagation in the VHF and UHF ranges? What's the noise floor look like?" Caldwell stared at him. The terms were familiar from technical briefings, but hearing them from this relic, this farmer in the middle of nowhere, was profoundly jarring. "That's classified information." "Then you're wasting both our time," Keene said, and he started to turn away, heading toward a small kitchen. "This conversation is over." "Wait," Caldwell said, his voice sharper than he intended. A sliver of uncertainty had pierced his professional armor. "How do you know to ask that?" Keene paused, his hand on the kitchen door frame. "Because if you don't know the nature of the problem, you can't find the solution. You came here looking for a tool. You should have been looking for an answer." He disappeared into the kitchen, and a moment later, the sound of a kettle being filled at a hand pump echoed into the room. Caldwell stood in the middle of the living room, feeling a profound sense of dislocation. The entire situation was sliding out of his control. He was the one with the badge, the authority, the mission. But for the first time in his career, he felt like he was the one being interrogated. The man was right. They didn't know the specifics, only that everything had gone silent. The diagnostics teams were blind. He keyed his radio, a useless gesture. "Finch, are you still there?" Only static answered. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the room into a deep, storm-induced twilight. Caldwell swore under his breath. The grid was down. Of course it was. "Generator will kick on for the well in the fridge," Keene's voice came from the kitchen. "But not much else. No need to waste the fuel." He emerged a moment later, holding 2 thick ceramic mugs. In the gloom, his movements were deliberate, unhurried. He set one mug on a small table and gestured for Caldwell to sit. The agent, feeling his authority ebb with every passing second, found himself sinking into a sturdy, handmade wooden chair. Keene lit an old kerosene lamp on the mantel, and its warm, flickering glow pushed back the shadows, making them dance in the corners. The light caught the deep lines on his face, making him look ancient, like a figure carved from oak. "The file that sent you here," Keene said, sitting opposite him. "What did it say?" "Exactly." Caldwell, now feeling more like a supplicant than an agent in charge, recited it from memory. "Contingency Protocol 7 Delta. In the event of catastrophic C4ISR failure in Sector Gamma, activate failsafe node designation Pathfinder. Location classified. See Appendix Z9. He paused. "Your farm was Appendix Z9. Keene nodded slowly, his eyes distant, as if looking at something a very long way off. "They still call it that," he murmured, more to himself than to Caldwell. "Pathfinder?" He took a sip from his mug. It was just hot water, Caldwell realized. No tea, no coffee, just steam rising into the cool air. The simplicity of it was another small, unsettling detail. "The terminal," Caldwell pressed, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Where is it?" "There is no terminal," Keene said simply. "Not the way you think of one." He stood up and walked to a corner of the room that was deep in shadow. He pulled away a simple canvas sheet, revealing not a sleek, modern piece of government technology, but something that looked like it belonged in a museum. It was a radio. A massive old shortwave transceiver with a bank of glowing vacuum tubes visible through a mesh grill. Its face was a landscape of heavy bakelite knobs, analog dials, and a large central tuning wheel. It was a Collins KWM-2, a legendary piece of equipment from the Cold War, but this one was different. It had been modified with extra inputs, custom switches, and braided copper grounding straps that ran down through the floorboards. It was immaculate, not a speck of dust on its olive drab casing. Keene ran a hand over the top of it, a gesture of deep familiarity, of affection. "This is the node, Agent Caldwell." Caldwell stared in disbelief. That's an antique. We need a secure, encrypted, frequency-hopping satellite uplink. That thing is a glorified AM radio." Keene didn't seem to hear the insult. His focus was entirely on the machine. He sat down in front of it in a straight-backed wooden chair, his posture changing subtly. The farmer's stoop was gone. He sat ramrod straight, his shoulders squared, his body aligned with the instrument before him. It was the posture of a professional, a technician, an operator. "Encryption is a matter of mathematics, not machinery," Keene said, his voice taking on a new resonance, a quiet authority that filled the small room. "And satellites are just targets in the sky. You can't jam gravity. You can't hack the ionosphere." He flicked a heavy toggle switch, and a low hum filled the room. The vacuum tubes began to glow with a soft orange light, warming the air around them. Caldwell watched, mesmerized in spite of himself. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. The nation's most advanced communication network was down, and the last hope was a man who looked like he'd just stepped out of a Depression-era photograph, using equipment that was obsolete before Caldwell was born. "This is insane," Caldwell breathed. "There's no way that can punch a signal through a military-grade jamming screen." "The jamming is sophisticated," Keene acknowledged, his fingers dancing over the knobs, tuning the main dial with a surgeon's precision. "It's designed to overwhelm modern digital receivers with white noise. It floods the spectrum. But it's loud. It's clumsy. A digital system tries to find a clear signal in all that noise. It's like trying to hear a whisper in a hurricane." He paused, listening intently to the static hissing from the speaker. He made a minute adjustment to a smaller knob. An analog system, with the right operator, doesn't listen for the whisper. It listens for the shape of the silence between the gusts of the hurricane. The jamming isn't uniform. It can't be. There are always gaps, microseconds, tiny windows. You just have to be able to find them and stitch them together. He pulled a set of old padded headphones over his ears, and the outside world seemed to vanish for him. His focus narrowed to the sound only he could hear, his expression one of absolute concentration. Caldwell felt a sudden profound sense of his own inadequacy. He was a systems man, a manager of technology. He gave orders, he followed protocols, he trusted the hardware. This man was speaking the language of the physics that underpinned it all. He wasn't using the technology. He was the technology. The room was tense, the only sounds the hum of the radio, the roar of the storm, and the crackle of static. The old man's breathing was slow and even, a measured cadence that seemed completely unaffected by the pressure of the situation. He was a rock in the middle of a raging sea. Caldwell stood up, his professional instincts screaming at him. This was a breach of every protocol he had ever learned. A civilian was operating an unsecured communication device during a national emergency. "Mr. Keene, I have to insist," he said, stepping toward the radio. "You have to let me take over. I need to report this. There are procedures for this." Samuel Keene didn't turn. He simply raised his left hand, a gesture that was not threatening, not angry, but carried an undeniable weight of absolute command. It said, simply, "Stop." And Caldwell, to his own astonishment, stopped. He froze in place, his words dying in his throat. The authority in that simple movement was more potent than any weapon or badge he had ever wielded. It was the authority of pure, undiluted competence. Keene's right hand, meanwhile, was a blur of motion. It darted out and tapped a small telegraph key attached to the side of the radio. A series of sharp staccato beeps cut through the static. It wasn't random. It was a pattern, a rhythm. Code. He sent a short burst, then listened, his head cocked slightly. He adjusted the dial by a hair's breadth. Another burst of code. He repeated this process for what felt like an eternity, a patient fisherman casting his line into a sea of noise, waiting for a bite. Caldwell found himself holding his breath. The arrogance and impatience had evaporated, replaced by a sense of awe. He was witnessing a master at work. He was watching an artist create something from nothing. The man's hands, which he had dismissed as the clumsy tools of a farmer, moved with an economy and grace that was breathtaking. Every motion had a purpose. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. It was the physical manifestation of a lifetime of practice. Suddenly, a new sound emerged from the speaker. It was faint, a tiny thread of coherence in the overwhelming static, a rhythmic series of beeps answering his own. Keen's expression didn't change, but Caldwell saw the muscles in his jaw relax slightly. He had made contact. He tapped out a longer message, his fingers a blur. Then he leaned back, listening. The room waited. The static hissed and popped. And then, a voice. It was distorted, swimming in noise, but it was undeniably human. Repeat last transmission. Authentication required. Caldwell's heart leaped. A voice. They had a connection. Keen reached up and pulled a small gooseneck microphone closer. He keyed the transmit button. "Standing by for authentication," he said, and his voice was different. The farmer's rasp was gone. It was clear, crisp, and formal. The voice of an operator. The voice from the speaker came back, slightly clearer this time. "Provide call sign. I repeat, provide call sign." Keen leaned into the microphone. He took a slow, steadying breath. Caldwell leaned forward, every fiber of his being focused on the old man. This was the moment. The name from the file. The key to this entire impossible puzzle. Samuel Keen spoke a single word into the microphone, a word that seemed to carry the weight of decades of silence, a word that resonated in the small room with the force of a thunderclap. Pathfinder. The silence that followed was different. It was not the absence of noise, but the presence of a vast, held breath. The static from the radio speakers seemed to pause. For 3 full seconds, the world hung in suspension. Then the speaker crackled to life, and the voice that came through was utterly transformed. It was sharp, clear, and imbued with an electrifying urgency. All distortion was gone, as if the old man's word had been a key that unlocked a hidden channel. Pathfinder, authentication confirmed. Stand by. Signal is green. I repeat, signal is green. We have you. Transmit your traffic. The change was so instantaneous, so total, it was like a magic trick. Caldwell felt the hair on his arms stand up. The word, that name, hadn't just been an identifier. It had been a command. It had reconfigured something on the other end, opened a door that had been sealed shut. Keen didn't seem surprised. He picked up a notepad and a pencil, the graphite worn down to a nub. "Stand by," he said into the mic. "I'm preparing to transmit priority message for Stratcom." He looked at Caldwell, his eyes clear and sharp. "Your message, Agent." Caldwell was jolted back into action. He fumbled for the waterproof case containing the encoded message data. It was on a small encrypted drive designed to interface with standard military hardware. It's digital," he stammered, feeling foolish. "It's a data packet." Keen gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He pointed to one of the custom modifications on the radio, an input jack that looked like a standard audio port. "The encryption is layered. Read me the 7-word key phrase for the outer layer, slowly." Caldwell read the nonsensical string of words, his voice trembling slightly. Keen didn't write them down. He just listened, his eyes closed. Then his hands flew across the telegraph key again, tapping out a long, complex stream of code. It was a digital handshake, performed manually. "Key accepted," he said, turning a dial. "The radio is now functioning as a modem, a very slow one. Plug in your drive." Caldwell did as he was told, his hands shaking as he connected the device. A small light on the drive blinked. Data was transferring, slowly, painfully slowly. But it was moving. Through the storm, through the jamming, through the impossible distance, a signal was being sent, carried on the back of ancient technology and the skill of one forgotten man. It took 10 minutes, 10 of the longest minutes of Caldwell's life. He watched the blinking light, listened to the quiet hum of the radio, and studied the old man's face. He saw the immense fatigue in the lines around his eyes, but also the iron control, the unyielding focus. This was not just a skill for him, it was a part of his very being. Finally, the light on the drive went solid, then dark. "Transmission complete," Keen said, his voice now showing the strain. He unplugged the drive and handed it back to Caldwell. He leaned back in his chair, the rigid operator's posture finally dissolving back into the stoop of an old farmer. He looked tired, bone tired. The radio crackled again. "Pathfinder, message received and verified. Good copy. Stand by for Echo Zulu protocol." "Acknowledged," Keen said into the mic, his voice a low rasp again. He switched off the transmitter and pulled the headphones from his ears, setting them gently on the console. The hum of the tubes faded, and the room was once again filled with the sound of the storm. "Echo Zulu protocol?" Caldwell asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What's that?" Keen looked at him, his pale eyes seeming to see right through him. "It means they're coming." It started as a low, deep thrumming, a vibration felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. It was a sound that didn't belong in a Nebraska thunderstorm. The rhythmic beat grew steadily louder, cutting through the howl of the wind. It was the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors, and they were close. Frighteningly close. Caldwell rushed to the window, peering out into the maelstrom. Through the sheeting rain, he saw it, a dark, menacing shape descending from the bruised sky. It was a military helicopter, a MH-60 Blackhawk, painted in non-reflective black, with no lights and no markings. It moved with a terrifying stability, seemingly indifferent to the gale-force winds that were bending trees to the ground. It wasn't landing, it was planting itself, its powerful downdraft flattening the long grass in Keen's field. The precision was breathtaking. "They can't land in this," Caldwell exclaimed. "It's impossible." "For some," Keen said quietly from his chair. He hadn't moved. He seemed to be husbanding his energy, gathering himself. The helicopter touched down, its skids sinking slightly into the wet soil. The side door slid open and figures began to disembark, moving with a fluid, predatory grace. Even from a distance, their silhouettes were unmistakable. They were soldiers, elite soldiers. Clad in black tactical gear, armed with advanced weaponry, they moved with the eerie, coordinated efficiency of a wolf pack. They established a perimeter around the farmhouse in seconds, their movements economical and purposeful. 10 of them, Caldwell counted. 10 heavily armed operators appearing out of a hurricane in the middle of nowhere, 10 minutes after a call sign was spoken into an antique radio. The front door opened before the lead soldier could even reach it. Samuel Keen stood there, silhouetted against the warm lamplight from within. He looked small and frail against the backdrop of the storm and the military might assembling on his lawn. The team leader, a tall man with the rank of a lieutenant commander visible on his collar, stopped on the porch. He removed his helmet, revealing a sharp, intelligent face, rain plastering his short hair to his scalp. He and his men were soaked, but their focus was absolute. He ignored Agent Caldwell completely, his eyes fixed on the old man in the doorway. The commander's hard, professional gaze softened, replaced by an expression of profound, undiluted reverence. He took a step forward, his movements suddenly losing their tactical edge, becoming simply human. He stopped a respectful distance from Keen. He didn't salute. A salute would have been too formal, too impersonal for this moment. Instead, he simply inclined his head, a gesture of deep personal respect. "Pathfinder," the commander said, his voice clear and strong over the wind. "Lieutenant Commander Jensen, we received your signal. It's an honor, sir." Agent Caldwell felt the world tilt on its axis. The federal agent, the man of authority, was now just a spectator to a scene he couldn't comprehend. He stood frozen, a ghost in the room, utterly invisible to the men on the porch. The interaction was between the SEAL commander and the old farmer. No one else mattered. "Sir," Caldwell finally managed to choke out, stepping forward. "Commander, I'm Agent Caldwell, FSA. What is this? Who is this man?" Lieutenant Commander Jensen finally turned his head, his eyes sweeping over Caldwell. The warmth was gone, replaced by a gaze as cold and hard as chipped flint. It was the look of a man who assessed threats for a living, and he had clearly decided Caldwell was not one, but was perhaps an annoyance. "This man," Jensen said, his voice low and dangerous, "is the reason my team can communicate right now. He's the reason the vital intelligence you were carrying is sitting on a general's desk at Stratcom instead of on a useless hard drive in your pocket." He took a step inside, his men fanning out behind him, securing the small house with practiced ease. They moved like shadows, their eyes missing nothing. They paid a wide, respectful berth to Keene and his radio. "The fail-safe node you were looking for, Agent," Jensen continued, his eyes boring into Caldwell's. "It isn't a place. It's not a piece of hardware. It's a person. We just call him Pathfinder." He gestured back toward Keene, who had retreated to his chair by the radio, looking weary but composed. Samuel Keene was the lead architect of the original GhostNet project back in the 70s. He designed the entire covert communications network from the ground up. It's a layered system. The public-facing satellites and fiber optics are just the skin. Beneath that are dozens of redundancies. But Keene built in a final layer, a ghost in the machine, a hardwired, biologically keyed kill switch and reboot sequence that exists completely off the grid. Caldwell's mind struggled to keep up. Biologically keyed? His voice, Jensen explained, a note of awe in his own tone. His call sign, spoken by him, into an analog receiver configured to his exact specifications, is the only thing that can trigger the Echo Zulu protocol. It doesn't just open a channel, it initiates a full system purge and reboot of the core servers from a secure, isolated power source. He designed it so that the only person who could ever bring the network back from total collapse was him. He is the key. Caldwell looked from the formidable SEAL commander to the quiet old man sitting by the glowing tubes of the radio. The farmer with the gnarled hands. Pathfinder. A legend he'd never even known existed. The file hadn't been an address for a facility. It had been the address of the system's creator, its final guardian. The SEALs worked with astonishing speed. They set up their own portable satellite dish, a compact, powerful device that they plugged directly into a port on Keene's old radio. They were piggybacking on the stable connection he had forged. Within minutes, they had established a secure, wide-bandwidth link, and data began flowing back and forth between the farmhouse and the outside world. The mission was a success. The immediate crisis was being managed. Caldwell felt like a man who had been sleepwalking his whole life and had just been violently shaken awake. His entire worldview, built on protocols, hierarchies, and the infallibility of modern technology, had been shattered in the space of an hour. He walked over to where Samuel Keene was sitting. The old man was not watching the high-tech flurry of the SEAL team. He was carefully wiping down the bakelite knobs of his radio with a soft cloth, his movements slow and methodical. "Sir," Caldwell began, his voice thick with humility. "Mr. Keene, I had no idea. I was dismissive. I was arrogant. I'm sorry." Keene paused in his work. He looked up, and his pale blue eyes held no trace of anger or triumph. There was no "I told you so" in his gaze. There was only a deep, profound weariness, and perhaps a flicker of understanding. "The job isn't about who knows, son," Keene said, his voice the quiet rumble of the farmer once more. "It's about getting it done. You had a protocol to follow. You followed it. The protocol was flawed, not you." The simple, direct forgiveness was more humbling than any rebuke could have been. Keene was absolving him, teaching him in the same breath. It wasn't about ego. It never had been for him. It was only ever about the mission and the quiet stewardship of a duty he had carried in silence for nearly 40 years. Lieutenant Commander Jensen approached, overhearing the exchange. He put a hand on Caldwell's shoulder. "What you saw him do tonight, Agent, most people think that's magic. It's not. It's mastery. That man spent 30 years in places that only exist as blacked-out lines in classified reports. The calluses on his hands aren't just from a plow. He taught men like me how to survive when everything else fails. He taught us how to listen to the silence." Caldwell looked at Keene's hands again. He saw them not as the hands of a farmer, but as the hands of an operator, a craftsman, a soldier. He imagined them tuning a radio in a jungle-listening post, tapping out code from a safe house in a hostile city, building an antenna from scrap wire in the middle of a desert. These hands had kept secrets, saved lives, and held the nation's last line of communication within their grasp. He finally understood. An hour later, the storm had begun to break. The torrential rain softened to a steady drizzle, and the wind's roar subsided to a low moan. The SEALs had packed up their gear as quickly and efficiently as they had deployed it. The network was stable, back in friendly hands. The immediate threat had been neutralized. Lieutenant Commander Jensen stood on the porch with Keen, the two men framed by the doorway. "We can have you extracted, sir," Jensen said, his tone respectful, as offering a way out. "Take you somewhere secure. You've been compromised." Keen looked out at his fields, dark and glistening under the retreating storm clouds. A sliver of moon was visible. He drew in a deep breath of the clean, rain-washed air. "This is my secure location, Commander," he said. "My work is here now." He gestured with one of his gnarled hands toward the barn, toward the neat rows of crops stretching into the darkness. He had served his country in the shadows for a lifetime. This farm, this piece of earth, was his peace. He had earned it. Jensen nodded, understanding completely. "Understood, sir. We'll black hole this location from the records. As far as the world is concerned, this was just a temporary relay we set up." He extended his hand. "Thank you, Pathfinder." Keen took it, and the two men shook, a silent transfer of respect and history passing between them, the old master and the modern warrior. Then, Jensen and his team melted back into the night, boarding their helicopter. The engine spooled up, and with a deafening roar, the Black Hawk lifted off, vanishing into the dark clouds as quickly and mysteriously as it had arrived. The silence it left behind was deep and profound. Caldwell stood by his sedan, the mud sucking at his ruined shoes. He watched Samuel Keen walk slowly back into his simple farmhouse. The light from the kerosene lamp cast a warm glow through the window. For a moment, he saw the old man move to the radio, gently draping the canvas sheet back over it, putting his secrets to bed for the night. The door closed, and the house was just a house again. A weary old farmhouse at the end of a muddy track, indistinguishable from 1,000 others. Caldwell finally got into his car. He didn't start the engine right away. He just sat there, looking at his own reflection in the rain-streaked window. He saw the face of a man who had started the day certain of his place in the world, of the rules and the systems that governed it. Now he saw a stranger. He had been shown a glimpse of a deeper reality, of a world held together not by technology and protocols, but by the quiet, unwavering dedication of forgotten heroes. He saw the truth, that the greatest strength is often hidden in the humblest of places, and the most important guardians are the ones you never see at all. He started the car, the modern engine a jarring contrast to the silence he had just experienced. As he drove away down the muddy track, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The image of the quiet old farmer and his radio was burned into his memory forever. He was no longer just Agent Caldwell. He was a man who had met Pathfinder, and that had changed everything.